Hi, everybody. This week we brought on a special guest, Mobius Risk Group's VP of Commodity Risk, Sarah Blome. Sarah's here to discuss global supply of heavy crudes ahead of potential maximum pressure campaigns on Iran and Venezuela, and what these changes mean in the context of the U.S.'s refining and transportation infrastructure. As an agent on behalf of clients, Sarah is responsible for all oil sales and negotiations at Mobius, and that includes revenue and cost strategies, basin and quality differentials, and pipeline and truck transportation agreements. Let's hop in. We're back on the energy desk on January 10th. We were sitting here around midday Central, and I'm with Sarah Blome, a guest. We have Zane out this week. Sarah, how's it going?
Going great. How are you?
Doing great. And excited to talk to you. Last week we talked with Zane about some of the Iran and Venezuela potential reinstatement of sanctions enforcement. Generally, just talked about the high level of what that might mean for total crude supplies. But I think that opens up an opportunity for us to talk a little bit more about kind of the underlying difference of what we are looking for with different crude grades and how different supplies of those crude grades could affect different stakeholders. And I think you are particularly suited to talk about that. And I think maybe it'd be helpful for the listeners just to get a little introduction for you and what you do with Mobius.
Absolutely. So I think people are most used to Zane, so I'm going to relate my experience to his. Zane is our macro guy who does more of the international markets, the total price of crude. If you see it on news, right, WTI, right, that's what Zane talks about. Whereas I'm more the boots on the ground with the producers. You know, here's my wellhead in Texas or North Dakota, and what does that mean for me and my crude that I'm producing? So if it has to do with physical movement of your production to somewhere else, that's me.
Right. So pipeline, truck, transportation agreements, looking at basin and quality differentials. And I think that, in that last point right there, what is your version of basin and quality differentials? How would you explain that to listeners who maybe aren't as familiar?
So all crude is priced, I'm going to say, lots of generalities here, and there are lots of caveats to everything I say, and we're just going to hope we hit the 80% rule on everything.
Right, not go too into the weeds for sure.
So crude is priced off of Brent, and WTI is the American relation of crude to Brent. And then differentials are based on what is the quality of your crude and where is it located in reference to where WTI is, which is in Oklahoma. And I can go on a very big rant about how Oklahoma is not any kind of market hub for crude, but we'll skip that part and just say it's in relation to Oklahoma.
Okay. And so the different qualities, really what we're looking at is going to be API gravity, sulfur content, anything else that you'd throw in there?
Yes. Those I will say are the big ones, right? That will get you qualified into a certain grade, but then you're talking about any kind of inclusions, mercaptans, H2S, right? What makes it difficult to get to? You know, I always talk about what is even the road quality when you're talking about what is your crude worth, even though road quality isn't priced into an area differential, it will impact you on your pricing.
So I think that the conversation about these different crudes is really an important one because a common misconception when we're looking at benchmarks like Brent or WTI is that we don't actually consume crude directly. And what we really care about is what those crudes are producing. And when we're talking about these different grades, I think that opens up the conversation about the refineries and how different refineries around the world are pooled for certain grades of crude. Can you maybe give us a breakdown of maybe the U.S. preferred slate and how that is different from other regions of the world?
So the U.S. preferred slate is going to be one of those things that I'm going to talk in a very general mindset, but we like a mix of all kinds of crudes we get our hand on, which is light, medium, and heavy. And unfortunately, we don't produce all of those grades, which is why we import especially the heavies, right? And so you've got units, right? Your coking units, your desalination units, your SRUs that the refineries have to help them process those heavy crudes. And while in theory they can retool themselves to not run as much of it, they can't retool themselves to not run any of it. And anytime that they do that, they're certainly getting lower profits if they're not running a slate that actually makes sense to them.
Right. Really, the higher complexity of a refinery's tooling or the complexity of their configuration is going to let them find heavier crudes and get more high value products like your distillates and what else might be kind of
and it's not necessarily about higher value products, right? It's about what their units are meant to be running, right? So if you have a unit specifically tooled to a specific type of crude and you run a different crude, then you're either not running at maximum capacity or you're running something that could actually harm your unit.
On a high level, you have, I guess, this general principle as we're kind of keeping this in line. The lower complexity refineries are going to be running generally lighter crudes. Higher complexity refineries are generally going to be running heavier crudes. And in the US, we predominantly have the refineries to run heavier crudes. So I think maybe that opens up the door to talk about what's going on with Iran and Venezuela. I'll just kind of give a high level overview again, what we talked about last week. With President-elect Trump coming in, we have a reasonable probability that we'll have a reinstatement of sanctions enforcement on Iran and Venezuela, and specifically their oil industries. In the previous Trump administration, we had this maximum pressure campaign where the Trump administration, through sanctions, was able to cut Iranian and Venezuelan combined production by about 60%. So just for kind of rough numbers throughout, in the start of President Trump's first administration, we had Iran and Venezuelan production at about 6.2 million barrels per day. And by the end of that first administration, production for both those countries was down to about 2.5 million barrels per day. And so since then, part of the issue that we've talked about on previous episodes of the Energy Desk is that between the energy crisis of 2022 and some of the other concerns about tight global supply, sanctions enforcement was a little bit, I guess, softer on both these countries for different periods and for different reasons. But over the Biden administration, Venezuelan and Iranian production has gained back considerably, about 1.5 to 1.7 million barrels per day above where they were when the first Trump administration ended. So the real concern is, okay, how quickly will the second Trump administration reinstate sanctions and how effective will those be? There's plenty of discussion about the shadow fleets, the shadow vessels that Russia, Venezuela, and Iran are using to move their crude around the world. But for kind of the sake of this conversation, I think it's safe to say if we did lose something, if we lost, say, 1.5 million barrels per day, that could potentially pose downstream consequences for the heavier slates specifically. So Venezuela produces predominantly their primary grade is the Murray, extra heavy sour. It's a heavy crude. And then Iran has Iran heavy and Iran light. And I think this is particularly interesting because we have in Mexico the Dos Bocas refinery, 340,000 barrels per day coming online. They've had plenty of announcements about this for the last 2 years, but I think 2025 might be the year that they actually follow through and bring this to commercial operations. And that would impact supplies of Mexico's Maya grade, which is also a heavy grade and one of the grades that the U.S. tends to import quite a bit of. So I think it's shaping up to potentially have a supply side impact for heavier grades. And I think that could have a downstream impact on U.S. refiners specifically. In your eyes, how would you think about that? What are some of the things that come to mind that U.S. refiners or stakeholders in the U.S. should be thinking about or are probably already thinking about?
I think that you hit on a very interesting intersection of events. One of the things I'm going to throw at you that we hadn't talked about yet is the TMX pipeline, which is the Canadian crude pipeline that has definitely impacted the amount of crude that we're seeing on the Gulf Coast that's heavy, right? And part of, I think, not a direct correlation, but the compounding of that is Venezuelan imports have drastically increased over the last year. I think I read a quote that it's up 64%. So if we lose that, the question is, where do we replace it from? And you said, Mexico Mayan, that's perfect grade, like Canada, very close to us, right? Not significant shipping costs to get it here. But if that refinery comes online like it's supposed to, and we lose not only Venezuelan crude, but also Mexico Mayan crude, we certainly aren't going to replacing one with the other. And now we have a dearth of both. So that's where it then relates to TMX, where you would think that we would just turn to Canada and pull some of those heavies from there, run more. But that crude was selling at a minus 20 discount at the Gulf Coast before pipeline came on. Now it's at a minus 12. So if we want to reroute that crude towards us, there's also a significant cost there in 2025 that wasn't there in 2023.
Right.
So even if you can run it, the question is at what cost?
Right. And it's interesting regarding the Canadian crudes this week, the EIA's preliminary weekly import data showed that U.S. imports of Canadian crude hit a new record high of over 4.4 million barrels per day. And so we're seeing, obviously, I think, more crude going to the U.S. West Coast with the TMX pipeline, obviously going from Alberta to the Pacific Coast. And we've also seen, interestingly, a recovery in imports to the Midwest, PADD 2, pretty close to pre-TMX 2024 levels, about 3.1 million barrels per day. Do you have any thoughts on where that goes from here, or related to your point there about the cost, the transportation costs, how that could fit in?
So you quoted, I think it was, I forget the number if you want to throw it at me again, of how much Canadian is imported right now.
About 4.4 million barrels per day.
I think the problem is that number is a technicality. When people hear imported, they think that we are taking that crude and running that crude, but it is going towards the West Coast, and straight from the West Coast, it is going into boats and going to, again, generality there, but it's not staying here. It's just there's a very small leg of this pipeline that does have to go through the U.S. to get to water. And so when we quote that, we're not accounting for how much doesn't actually stay here. So yes, we have seen some increased flows because getting the extra $6-8, right, not going to U.S. refineries does justify more drilling, which does encourage more that doesn't make it to those markets to come to ours. But again, I've seen the pricing of that crude get more competitive, even if it is making its way here.
Right. Yeah, and on the Iran and Venezuela front, it's also connects to Canada's exports because China has been, for the last couple of years, the primary purchaser of sanctioned barrels from Iran and Venezuela. I think rough numbers for listeners, over 90% of Iranian exports go to China. And for the heavies, that's going to really be China's teapots. They're smaller or independent refineries. And lately, I guess this week, actually, we've been seeing some interesting developments. As we approach the inauguration of President Trump, China has been changing their policies at ports on whether or not they'll accept vessels that are on the U.S. sanctions list. And they've been, in the last few days, saying that none of these sanctioned vessels are going to be able to dock at any of those ports and offload. So if China is losing their supplies of these discounted sanctioned barrels, China and India are going to be two of those main players. Where are they going to turn? And then we'll have some downstream impacts for other refineries or other purchasers of these different grades. Maybe that's an opportunity. Where else outside of Canada might the U.S. turn to following sanctions reinstatement if there is a supply disruption?
So there are small pockets of crude in America that are heavy. I'll say most of them are on the West Coast and kind of stay in those refineries. And so you can encourage growth from those production fields if the money is there. The other thing, though, is you're going to have to look to newer markets, not necessarily newer markets, but the same markets that always have heavy crudes that we haven't necessarily purchased from before because the cost of getting it here hasn't been justified when you have something much closer with less transportation cost.
Right.
We also don't necessarily have the import base, right, to bring in as much as I think we would need if the stuff that's coming in locally isn't going to work out.
Right. Yeah. And so I guess maybe drilling down into the more local landscape, what are some of the challenges or problems that are unique to U.S. differentials from the perspective of the producer, marketing, hedging, anything in that category that connects here?
I think from a local producer standpoint, one of the challenges to look forward at is, will the refineries replace this crude, right? Because we talked about how they prefer to run this grade, a heavier grade, with all the other stuff that they can get locally. We've seen U.S. refineries run more and more light crude as we've produced more and more of it. I think the Gulf Coast has started running, 2% more lights, which doesn't sound like a lot, but changing your slate that much truly is a big movement for a refinery. So the question is, in the face of this, if you can't get something, I guess I want to go backwards. The comment I want to make is, if you can find something cheaper and you can make it work, you run it as a refinery, right? I have seen slates change when grades change so that they can run something that makes maybe less product out the outset of the refinery, but what they're running is cheaper. So the fact that they're getting less money out of it, right, in for their products, is offset by the fact that they're able to put the crude through it for cheaper. And so if we can run lighter crudes, which we can, at what point do we just start changing that slate even more towards the lighter products and dropping the heavies? But when we do that, I think the biggest impact we're going to see is less heavy products, right? Which is less asphaltenes, which I don't think anybody has really thought of the impact of less asphaltenes and less marine fuels, which is what you're going to see coming out of the US if we have to change our slates.
What are the timelines associated with changing a slate? How quickly can a refinery adapt to a shift?
I mean, there's small changes, right? Like running a little bit more of one product than the other product. They can always, in theory, shut down a coker and just bypass it. I've seen that done. But tooling it to completely run a different crude is nigh impossible, right? You can't get the permits to change your refinery. And we've seen that repeatedly.
Yeah, and the permitting is especially an interesting one with some of the EPA rulings that have come out. I mean, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's worth mentioning how the emissions regulations have changed so that if you make any changes to your infrastructure that could, adjust your emissions, then it's essentially treated as building a new facility, and you have to get those permits again. And so a lot harder to do that now, especially for older infrastructure. So definitely a disincentive there. And I think on the U.S. refining front, I think that really does bring up a topic that you could have some interesting points on is, what is the current state of the U.S. refinery infrastructure? What are some of the changes that are maybe happening to U.S. infrastructure? And I'll have some follow on for that, but on those two.
The U.S. has some of the oldest refineries in the world, and those refineries have not gone through major changes. I think the last refinery in the United States was built in 1976. And since then, we've just been trying to slowly bolt on whatever units are needed. And you did hit on a very great point that with the new EPA rulings, those bolt-ons are going to be less and less likely to happen when they're already so few and far between. And I don't believe anybody really has one ongoing right now.
I guess in Sarah's world, if you could have a new refinery placed anywhere in the country, where are we putting a...
So what would make the absolute most sense is if we get some brand new refineries built that process light crude from the shale revolution, because we had this massive ability to get not as much crude as we want, because that's an extrapolation, but a very significant amount of crude as wanted, as more than needed, right? Because we even had the Permian, right? Back in 2013, we could produce way more than anybody wanted, but there was nowhere for it to go. So then that's when we started allowing the exporting of American crude, which previously hadn't been allowed since the 70s. And so we can drill as much crude as we want. We now have to send to other places because the fact of the matter is we don't have refineries here that can truly process it in the quantities that's needed. And other people, other countries are building refineries that can process our crude. And so if we could mimic them, right, and build something that could actually process what we have here, that would make a significant amount of sense. But we're doing the opposite and not only not allowing the building of new refineries, but not allowing the adaptation of the refineries that we have now.
Right. Yeah, I think that's something that's not well understood in a lot of the kind of general media. When they're talking about U.S. refineries using U.S. crude, we're producing about 13.5 million barrels per day. But as you mentioned, incremental production has turned to exports. And so now we're running into the limitations of export infrastructure. But to kind of get a location from you, if you're putting a refinery, where does it make sense for the U.S. to have new infrastructure if we were able to get through these regulatory barriers?
It would make sense to put a refinery where the production is, which we just talked about all the exports that we have from the Permian. So to some degree, people would point to that as where refineries should logically go. West Texas, New Mexico, which we do have refineries there already. But, EOG, who is part of the Eagle Ford Shale revolution, has stated that they're going to have a bunch of new production in the Utica. We haven't necessarily seen it yet, but we have seen the production from there vastly increase year on year. And I would say there's something to putting your ear to, is that going to be the next Permian? I don't know. Everybody says they have the next Permian, right? But it is something to keep an eye on. And the problem with placing a refinery in the United States in a place that makes sense is that we are a very large country and we produce from all over it. And we don't know where the next producing area is necessarily going to be. And nobody can tell the future, right? So how do you justify building something that's going to cost in the billions, hoping that the crude shows up for it? Because if you wait till the crude is there, then the crude's already declining by the time it's time to run it through your refinery once the refinery is built.
So I think that also raises a question about the transportation of crude, whether by pipeline or truck. Maybe you can kind of talk about.
And that's why I matter. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's where the diffs come into play. It's a question of, right, where is your production? Where is the refinery? It's the best refinery to run that production because it might necessarily be the refinery that's closest to you. And then what is the transportation cost between the refinery that's closest to you, the refinery that's the best refinery to run your production? And then justifying the differences between those two things when you choose what market you're going to start selling to.
Right. And so the limiting factor is, do you have a pipeline first? And then is there capacity on the pipeline? And then if not either of those, then you're looking at trucks. And I guess if we're looking at new production in the U.S. and this question of transportation is coming up, what is the current landscape of pipeline infrastructure in the U.S.? And then are there any projects that are going to come online imminently that you think are worth noting?
I think the most imminent pipeline that will have an impact on crude is, ironically, another export for Permian crude to Corpus to capitalize on the Corpus expansion and not U.S. refineries running more U.S. crude, but the U.S. exporting more crude to other markets.
Right. I guess digging into existing pipeline infrastructure / trucking, where does a new pipeline for the U.S. make the most sense, looking ahead beyond this new export capacity to Corpus?
New lines to the Gulf Coast, I think, in theory, always makes sense, right? But then you're dealing with cold weather. I think this is where it gets really interesting because I am not a pipeline person. And I spent my career with a pipeline company, right? El Paso. That's what they were known for. And the justification of, and it was mainly gas pipelines, but still, the justification of where to put something is so intriguing because it is that hunt for where is production coming from and where does it need to go, right? You ask me where to put a refinery. It's the same question as if I can't build a refinery, then it would make sense to build a pipeline from that production to a refinery. However, where is the production going to be? And so that's why the next pipeline is in the Permian, because we've already proven we can build out the Permian, right? We can certainly drill more. It's got way more reserves there. Let's drill it to the pipeline. Let's get it somewhere. The next question is, what is the quality of the crude? Right? Because certain crudes just don't play well with pipelines. Either their sulfur content is too high and they're degrading it, or if they're actually the heavies that we want, they're hard to move through a pipeline. So there are people who are paid to do this analysis who are not me, who will probably have a significantly better question because as somebody who doesn't make money off of pipelines, I think that they very rarely make sense, especially when you look at the cost of putting them in place. But then you're looking at more trucks on the road or rail cars carrying crude, which we also saw a lot of regulation come against. So, like you said, we have crude. It needs to go somewhere. How do you get it somewhere? Somebody will work out a solution for that if it turns out there's a mismatch between production refineries. But that solution is always difficult to get to. All right, I am going to talk about Utah. I said I wasn't going to talk about Utah on the podcast. I know you're going to make me talk about it. Okay. So I spent 10 years in the Uinta Basin, and it's a very perplexing place because the lack of infrastructure there. Granted, there are 5 refineries literally an hour and a half away. So when I say lack of infrastructure, the question is there really? And the answer is yes, because that basin wants to overproduce its refining capacity. So then we are asking, where does it go? And so we have spent years and much of my career researching different ways to move it. And obviously, pipelines don't make sense necessarily for that specific crude because
let's talk about that. Yeah.
All right.
So what is unique about the Uinta Basin and the crude that comes out of Uinta?
You walked me here and I didn't want to do it. It is a heavy crude. Look at you. Okay. So the Uinta Basin has a heavy crude, which ironically, the crude that we are drilling and exporting is the lighter of the heavy crudes of the basin. And if we really wanted to use it to replace U.S. refineries, you should be using the black ones. But nobody is truly drilling out that zone. So even though we are drilling this crude and exporting significantly more of it in these last few years than we have historically with the advent of bringing horizontal drilling to that basin, we're still not exporting the crude that's really necessarily the very best for refineries in the United States, right? But they are getting the most profitable crude out of there, which is the waxy. I mean, it's all waxy, but they're getting the yellow wax crude, which you definitely are just running for its waxy crude content, and that's getting lube oils, which is not a replacement for Venezuelan or Mexico Mayan, because that is more the heavy asphaltene sulfuric crude. All right, back to the question. How do we move it, and does it make sense to the pipeline there? Well, there was a pipeline there that got shut in sometime in the 80s because it had 2 heaters that were next to each other that were utilized to keep the crude liquid, because if you heat it up enough, it becomes a liquid. And they went offline and it solidified, and then the pipeline. Leak is a loose word because a liquid leaks, right? But when you have a solid that outgrows its capacity, it's more of a slow, I'm not calling it a slow explosion because no explosion is slow, but you get that it's like when you fill a pipe with a candle. It's right. That location, quote unquote, makes the most sense for a pipeline. Unfortunately, a pipeline does not make sense for that location and that quality of crude. So then, you're looking at mixing the crude with something else, condensate, et cetera, to help it flow more. But then you are degrading the value of the crude because you've mixed it and it's not the blend the refineries want.
Right. And so you have this solid-ish waxy crude, hard to transport in a pipeline. So that really leaves you with trucks, which is a big one that is used in the Uinta now, or rail. I think there is an interesting conversation about the rail for Uinta. That is in flux. There's a Supreme Court case on the Uinta Basin rail project. One, where do you see that? Where do you see that going from the legal perspective? And then if, let's say, it fails, what are the alternatives? Just to keep doing, trucks? Can you just increase production into more and more trucks, or how's this gonna work?
So that crude will always, again, generic air quotes, have to be trucked at least to a central point, right? So we're not getting the trucks off of the roads completely. When people hear you have a solution, they always think it's all the way to the wellhead, and it never truly is for the most part. So let's just pretend we're going to have some kind of centralized rail facility in that area that we do. That's kind of what we have now, right? You are trucking crude to Price River Terminal or the Price area, and you are then railing it out. And that solution does work. It is not necessarily optimized, but the point is that it's not like the crude is going to end up getting shut in because there's no railroad out, because there is a railroad out and we're currently utilizing it.
And really the plan of the project is right now they're predominantly going to Salt Lake City or the Salt Lake area, but they're trying to open up some exports to the Gulf via rail through Colorado.
At this point, I would say that they aren't actually predominantly going to Salt Lake City refineries. I think that there is roughly a 50-50 split, or at least at certain times they are. There's still, yes, going to fulfill Salt Lake City refineries first, but there is a significant amount of crude coming out of that area. Yes, going to the Gulf Coast, but there are other refineries in the United States that can run it as well. But those refineries don't have as direct a rail pathway, which is one of the things that this would help. It would open up newer markets for that crude that isn't necessarily the markets that already are full, right? I'm not going to say Gulf Coast is full, but Gulf Coast is running and it's got easy imports, whereas refineries that are in the mid-continent that are more landlocked have a harder time getting replacement crudes and mixing their grades and their slates around.
Right. Yeah, so we'll see how that pans out in the cases that are ongoing right now. But I guess it's kind of a final takeaway for listeners. Is there anything that you have your eye on right now that is just interesting to Sarah that could potentially affect anybody in the U.S. or just anything that you're watching?
I've sent you all my papers on, are they going to shut down DAPL, yes or no? And the truth is probably not ever, but it's really fun for me to watch all the anger, right? I didn't hit on that, right? When you build a new pipeline, you are going through someone's property, right? Mm-hmm. People don't like that. And ironically, my brother-in-law does not have any drilling on his property, but there's one across the road from him. Right? That was a big, got lots of oil under it apparently. So he gets to live with bright lights from a rig shining in his house all the time. It's the same with pipelines, where even if it doesn't go through your property, it's going to have an impact on your life if you're nearby it. And there is significant legal and emotional impact to people, right? When we build those pipelines that we don't necessarily put thought to when we ask, should we build it? And so DAPL is one of the latest ones that's been built in the United States, and it's got people angry, and they're still angry about it. And even though it's in service, they keep bringing up things to try to take it out of service. Mm-hmm. I mean, granted, once it's in the ground, I think you're kind of out of options, but that's not true, right? Anybody could always shut anything down if they feel like it, if there's a justified reason to. So yes, that is one of my things I keep my eye on as the latest pipeline built in the United States that carries crude across state, if and when the outrage of it being built will ever die down. The DAPL still has the Army Corps of Engineers doing an environmental review on it, right? So in theory, should they pull their, what would I call it, approval, right, to have the pipeline built, in theory, it could be shut down, right? So that review keeps getting pushed back, and it's just been pushed back to 2025. And there has been a new lawsuit filed in October of 2024. So that's where I'm saying it's in contention still, even though it's been in ground for years.
Right. So still in flux on DAPL. And final point, returning to Canada, talked about the TMX pipeline. One of the questions that is also apparent with President-elect Trump is the tariff threat. 25% tariffs is the headline number that has been thrown around on Canada. And kind of like we've discussed previously, some of these tariff threats are negotiation tactics or just targeting the countries that have an outsized trade surplus against the United States. Whether or not they come to fruition or not remains to be seen, especially for a trade partner like Canada. But for the maybe smaller possibility that those tariffs do come into place, is there anything that you'd be on the lookout for U.S. stakeholders or anywhere else that you want to take that?
So we were in a non-podcast conversation. I just talked about how TMX is vastly exporting Canadian crude. We talked about how Canadian crude could be a replacement for Venezuelan heavy crude and Mexican Maya that we need. And so the question is, if we levy them with a 25% penalty because it comes to a very marginal amount of the United States, and then we waive it if they sell it to us, well, what do you know? That almost takes up the $8 of improvement that they were getting from selling it to us versus China. And isn't that a very interesting overlap? That you're going to lose the $8 of profit if you keep exporting it, and you're going to lose the $8 of profit if you send it here, but we're going to at least get our money from you if you export it. So I just find that number kind of lies with the $20 that the deduct was, and then the uplift you're getting. It's very unique. And I wonder sometimes if these things are as researched as they appear to be, or if it's just a number somebody threw out there that happens to have a whole lot of impact that they don't realize.
Right. Yeah, I don't assign a high likelihood to those tariffs coming into effect for a trade partner like Canada, but we'll see what that looks like in about 11 days. So yeah, I think we'll leave it there, and we have a few related graphs and data points that we'll throw into the deck in the show notes on Iranian, Venezuelan production, Mayan production, and some of the topics that we talked about today. But thanks for hopping on, Sarah.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us at The Energy Desk. Again, this is a limited series, so if you want to hear more episodes, you'll have to let us know by hitting follow wherever you get your podcasts, or by sending me a message at amelvin@mobiusriskgroup.com. See you soon. And please keep in mind, this commentary contains our views and opinions and is based on information from sources we believe are reliable. This commentary is for informational purposes, should not be considered investment advice, and is not intended as an offer or solicitation with respect to the purchase and sale of commodity interests, or to serve as the basis for one to decide to execute derivatives or other transactions. This commentary is not considered promotional material.